Hi, everyone. Welcome to On the Hook, the official YellowPike Media podcast. We're glad you're back. We have a great new guest with us this week, Jonathan Anastas. If I said that wrong, I'll owe you $5 later. But I'm pretty sure I got it right, Jonathan, right?
You did get it correct. Thank you.
Nice. I'm always 50-50 on names. And of course, Keith Pape, who is our CEO here at YellowPike. Today, we're going to be talking about the synergy between sports and gaming audiences. Jonathan, this is a subject you know a lot about. Why don't you give us a little background and introduce yourself and let the listeners know who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Jonathan Anastas. I'm board chair and executive chairman of Alpha Metaverse Technologies, used to be Alpha Esports. We're a publicly traded company on the Canadian Stock Exchange. I was group CMO at One Championship and One Esports. I was also global head of digital and social at Activision for a number of years and global head of marketing at Atari. So I've lived in the crossover space between gaming and esports and sports for quite a while.
Look at that! I've been part of every single one of those. I'm feeling like there's some history going on there. I'm like, oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. No, I'm not gonna miss any of them.
We've got great history going on.
I have a feeling I know how this episode's going to go. Keith, why don't you introduce yourself really quick so those that missed last episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Keith Pape. I'm the CEO and founder of YellowPike Media and YellowPike Gaming. 25 years in the advertising business, 15 in video games, and really I just buy the coffee and everybody else just makes me look good.
And I'm Rick Heaton. I'm the director of influencer and community activations here at YellowPike Media. I have been around this industry for a little over 20 years, both in studio life at Warner Brother Games and also with some gaming-related nonprofits and some indie studios. And I've spent the last 6 years ago, according to LinkedIn, is when I started along this path of madness. So, hi, everybody. So let's just dive right in, Jonathan. When we're talking about sports and gaming audiences, so they're different and yet they're the same, right? How are they the same? And then we'll talk about how are they different, these two, what seems on the surface to be very different audiences.
So to oversimplify a bit, right? Both areas, gaming and sports, generally skew male, generally skew younger, generally skew higher engagement for those participants, right? If you think about the pillars of what a Gen Y and Gen Z guys do on the internet, right? It's sports, it's esports, it's gaming, and it's music for the most part.
Makes sense. There's a lot of overlap in both of those audiences. I can see that. But how are they different? I know one of the ways is they monetize differently, right? So you have to kind of approach them very differently, despite the similarities.
They absolutely monetize differently. I think one of the big ways that they're different, and you're really seeing the tension here and the desire of traditional sports to change, is age, right? So traditional sports has an age problem depending on who you talk to and what sports you're talking about, right? That if you think that advertisers, and these are largely advertiser and sponsor driven categories, the Nirvana demographic is adults 18 to 34, is males 18 to 34. Traditional sports skew older. Even with less traditional sports, televised sports skew older. Right. Say, for example, the UFC's television audience is over 40. Their digital audience is under 40. So you're starting to see a lot of executive shuffle in that world. My old boss, Tim Ellis, famously and successfully went from Activision to the NFL, right? Because the NFL realized they needed to age down and they needed their audience to look more like a gaming audience. The ex-CMO of Twitch famously went to the NBA, right? And you would think the NBA didn't feel like they had an aging problem, right? But even the NBA sees the value of what gaming and game marketing and game promotion brings to sports. And so you're seeing the talent move back and forth. And even I was an example, right? I went from Activision to One Championship, a largely digitally driven organization, and a younger skewing sport. Combat sports and MMA skew younger. So the primary difference has been age. You raise a great secondary point, which is they monetize differently, especially esports. So if you think about the great monetization buckets of sports and esports and gaming, where are they different, where they're the same, is advertising and sponsorship, very big in both categories. And you're seeing a lot of the same brands in both categories. Direct to consumer, growing in both categories. The NFL has their own streaming product, their own SVOD service. The difference traditionally, especially in esports versus sports, has been media rights. That media rights is an incredibly lucrative bucket for traditional sports. The NFL has been really successful with monetization. Look at the deals they recently did with YouTube and they did with Amazon. They've doubled their media rights versus time before. Those traditional media rights have not followed into esports. There have been very few buyers at the high end, and even the high end buyers like YouTube and Twitch haven't written the same sort of checks. And I think that's been a surprise from where people thought esports was going. And I think it's had a lot to do with what's happened to valuations and monetization, and potentially, a bit of the reset in the valuation of esports companies is those media rights checks have not yet materialized.
I think there's been a big pain point with the early attempts at the franchising systems on the esports side. Just the math didn't work out, and I think they're really struggling with that right now.
Yeah, I think the math didn't work out because largely those media rights checks weren't there, right?
There's the balance to it is that they pay the big franchise fee, but there's an expectation that the media rights are going to follow.
Right, and in pre-pandemic, certainly ticket sales followed. I think
they were heading there.
I was part of Activision, when they sold 17,000 tickets or whatever to Barclays Center, right? So so there was a time where it's certainly, and if you look at South Korea and China, they can fill stadiums. So the ticketing piece of esports has definitely been there. But you're right, the media rights piece hasn't been there. I think the sponsorship stuff's been strong, and I think you've seen a lot of the same categories. The interesting thing is, you've seen automotive come in, you've seen fashion come in. One of the super interesting things is luxury has skewed esports in a way that I never anticipated, and in a way that I think has never followed into traditional sports, right? Who would have thought we would have lived in a world where Louis Vuitton would make the League of Legends case, right? And then Gucci has to have a follow on, and and it's
didn't Porsche just sign with FaZe? I think Porsche just signed with FaZe. FaZe or
Porsche just signed with FaZe.
FaZe, right? Yeah, I mean, huge.
Interestingly, after reading that BMW left the category, right? But that was an abnormality, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I'm talking about like real LVMH level, like luxury fashion, which you never would have thought. And what that really was, I think, is the high end fashion business stuck with print, stuck with older audiences, stuck with traditional marketing a long, long, long time, longer than they should have. And then there was like this OMG FOMO moment where they pivoted a huge amount of dollars very quickly because they sort of felt like we don't have the same resonance with Gen Z, especially, that we do with boomers or Gen X. And they sort of felt that they really needed to catch up, right? That, that Gucci or Louis Vuitton wasn't Yeezy, right? Wasn't ice cream.
They hadn't been making those investments for the last 10 years to start bringing that audience along with them. I think like famously BMW did in the early 2000s with the BMW films and Guy Ritchie. And they started early on going, okay, we're going to start investing really early in this. And I think that's why you said luxury didn't do it. The MLB and NFL didn't do it. I mean, I think you said, to your point before, I think I heard the average fan age at an MLB game or watching it MLB on TV is like 54, 56 years old. And the NFL is 48, 49, where I think the NBA, I think is more like the 34 to 36, which really is just above the core gaming audience. People talk about the lower end of gaming, but the real money monetizers are about 34 now. So it's like the NBA is right there. And I think you're right. This is what NBA is making their changes now so they don't run into this problem 10 years from now.
Yeah, exactly. And again, no surprise, even with Rihanna on the Super Bowl, right? Like as close as they've gotten to luxury now is like Savage Fenty, right? But to our earlier conversation, there's Louis Vuitton front and center in League of Legends. There's no Louis Vuitton front and center, in an NFL game.
No, they're not even close. But I think, like you said, they signed Jay-Z to a 10-year deal to run the halftime show as part of that effort to how do we start skewing long, even if they just show up for maybe a few minutes before halftime and a few minutes after halftime, I think they're hoping over time they'll start watching. They came in just for that piece and they're like, well, can we keep them an extra 10 minutes? Can we keep them an extra 20 minutes and start growing that? They're realizing they're behind, so they have to start doing things that are going to save them 10 years from now.
Absolutely. And even hashtag Fenty Bowl, right, is like a big
Right.
deal. It's like probably the first time a Gen Y, Gen Z, cosmetics brand has
Right.
trended in an NFL game.
Which also makes it worthwhile, because the big discussion this week was the fact that, of course, the performers don't get paid for the halftime show. There's no monetary exchange, but there is a media exchange, like hashtag Fenty Bowl, the ability, the benefit they get of doing that, but they don't actually get a check.
What's really interesting about that is, so if you go back a number of years, those performers were paid. And then the NFL, realizing that they have, the largest cumed audience probably left in the world in a singular event, short of like, maybe the World Cup, but I would think even greater, they went back and they actually tried to flip the game completely to you pay us. They didn't get all the way to you pay us, but to go from we pay you
Right.
to we don't pay you anything
Right.
was a big move. And the best breakdown of the economics I saw recently was an estimate that say the NFL goes to Apple writes a $50 million check.
Right.
NFL keeps 35, 15 of that 50 goes to pay production overhead.
Right.
So the performer's not technically paid, but the performer isn't out of pocket. I mean, I believe famously last year, the Weeknd felt that $15 million was not sufficient and went another $7 million out of his own pocket to up production.
The way he wanted, right.
But to your point, that proves that he believed there was an ROI there in
Right.
ticket sales or streams or whatever. If I'm going to go out of pocket now, let's be honest, he probably didn't go out of pocket. He went back to his label. He went back to
Yeah, that
sponsors.
money came. It's a.
But you think about that moment where Rihanna takes out the compact in the halftime show.
Right.
That's worth minimum $7 million, because that's what a 30-second spot
30
costs.
seconds, exactly.
Right. It was the ultimate product placement, right? I mean, it was just right there, and everyone knew what that compact was. Everyone knew that was a Fenty product.
And those costumes were custom made and are now being sold by Savage Fenty. So now that's 15 minutes. Now let's call that $100 million worth of media value.
Yeah. Right.
So Rihanna was paid.
Yeah.
And there's reports coming out now that there's actual monetary exchange going on in terms of her streams are up. So she's generating more revenue on Spotify and Apple Music and all these other sources of income for her. I think the estimate I saw was close to $100 million in value in just the number of streams and song purchases since Sunday night.
I think this comes back to Jonathan's point of they're bringing in a younger set of leader, entrepreneur, thinker who is going to use that time and effort wisely, where before they just wanted a check. These new ones are leaning into things that attract that young audience, attract the young entrepreneur, that the kind of people they want to surround themselves with.
Exactly. And you've seen this in gaming, right? I mean, Travis Scott playing in Fortnite, right? I mean, to some degree, the younging up of, the Super Bowl halftime show before Rihanna was, Travis Scott in Fortnite, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That was really the beginning of it. That was the first run at it, and everybody's seeing how powerful it is.
Absolutely. So how do you see that kind of impact on a traditional sport translating into esports? Is there a merge point for these? Is there a replacement point between traditional sports and esports, where, esports have been kind of struggling a little bit lately, especially in the US, to get footing? Like you said, the media deals aren't there. Is there a future where it is? Is there a future where you kind of look at an esport event as having the potential to pull in maybe not Super Bowl numbers, but maybe, Game 7 World Series numbers?
I am very bullish on that. I believe we're going to get there. I mean, it's obviously very different. Like, the amount of sort of like the physical and mental ability of sort of the ability to like twitch your fingers and overcome latency and all that stuff is not as obvious on the screen clearly as the sort of superhuman things that like traditional sports athletes do. And I think that's part of one of the things that's kind of holding it back. And also, for whatever reason, we haven't had the same, and maybe it's because of that sort of lack of obvious physicality, we haven't had the same level of kind of like breakout athletes, like where's the Conor McGregor of esports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that may never happen, right? Like we may live to some degree, like maybe esports is like chess, right? Like, because there's not this incredible physicality, like the world chess champion is not going to get, but oddly, there was a moment in time when F1 drivers were the highest paid athletes in the world when it
Right.
came to endorsements, and you can't really see their physicality either. They're inside a car. So I know I'm talking a bit out of both sides of my mouth, but maybe if I'm being optimistic, we live in a world where F1 drivers can be the highest paid athletes in the world and their physicality is largely hidden from the audience in a direct sense. We could live in a world where esports athletes become among the highest paid, athletes in the world.
Yeah.
And definitely, why not? I mean, and I think actually F1 and motorsports in general is actually a really good parallel because you don't see their physicality, and some people are, hashtag not an athlete goes around every now and then when people start talking about motorsports. But there's also, as those sports move in, does that mean there's an opportunity where maybe motorsports, which traditionally doesn't have massive viewership as it is, might actually be the bridge? Because it's so similar whether you're watching, an esport motorsport or you're watching a live motorsport. There's a lot of convergence there.
It starts writing that coattail of it doesn't take the physicality, but people are starting to appreciate things that do have other skills.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I don't know if either of you remember this from COVID, but when they couldn't run NASCAR in early COVID, they put actual NASCAR drivers in the NASCAR game, and the ratings were actually quite credible.
Yep.
Now, there's a big asterisk again, next to that, which is like what were they competing against, and there's not a lot of sports going on, but it was much more successful from a ratings perspective than I think they thought it would be when they were trying to do it to save the season, right?
Right.
So it's absolutely possible, and also that could be a bridge just even in the games where like literally, motorsports athletes train for hours and hours and hours in the highest end of simulators, which are in essence the world's most advanced driving video games. Like I remember after he retired, Thomas Tipple, who is the vice chairman of Activision and was the COO when I was there, did that Ferrari challenge for a couple of years as like his post-retirement thing, and he would post endless social media posts of him in the simulator in his garage, right?
Yeah.
And he's spending 40 hours in the sim in his garage to spend 2 hours on a track.
Right. Well, actually, it was February 2020. Rick was actually at Daytona with a bunch of Fortnite players, and that's exactly what NASCAR was looking to do. NASCAR was looking to, bring the younger generation into NASCAR viewership.
Yep.
And we did this thing where they did kind of a watch party for the Super Bowl together with a couple of young NASCAR drivers, and then they flipped the switch 2 weeks later at Daytona, and they brought those Fortnite players, these Twitch streamers, to Daytona. And it's funny, that's the first thing they did was put them in the simulator. And Rick, you know that story better than I do, but how amazed those guys were, these Fortnite players, to be sitting in the sim and understanding that's how the drivers spend most of their time, not on the track anymore.
Yeah, it was really great having two of what were then considered mostly, very promising young and up and coming drivers with great family histories, kind of coaching Twitch streamers who are from a very different world on a simulator, which again, that kind of bridged that gap, right, to where it felt like a game to them, and just everybody coming to this interesting understanding, and then actually getting to go out and spend some track time and go through the pits and see what's involved. It was really an interesting activation because at the end of it all, there was an awful lot of understanding between these two groups that they're each sportsmen, they're each athletes. It's just a different sport played a different way. It was really well done. I thought our partners, Fox Sports, really helped us put together just such a fantastic activation. That more than accomplished the goal of kind of pulling in that audience.
The drivers definitely appreciated what the Fortnite players were doing when they played Fortnite with them, as they were getting destroyed. It's funny that there was a balance of power to it and a respect on both sides. Although when the Fortnite players got to get in the cars, it reminded me a little bit of Ford versus Ferrari when they put Mr. Ford into the car and take off down the street. He's crying and he's like, I had no idea. So there's still a reality to actually being in the car, which is awesome.
Definitely.
And we're increasingly seeing those bridge activations, right? That are going both ways, right? Like,
I think marketers are starting to get how important that is.
And you've got, professional athletes who aspire to be esports athletes. You have professional athletes that, aspire to own teams. If you remember, like in the final seasons of Ballers, right? It was
Right.
like you
Yeah.
saw those worlds come together, and that's very reflective of the real world, right?
Right.
Like musicians tour with gaming rigs. Athletes are on the bus and planes with gaming rigs, right?
Yeah.
Gamers are watching sports. To your point, there's this great mutual respect and
Yeah.
crossover.
Well,
And to the degree where
Kyler Murray's contract had to make a comment about him not playing Madden in it, during
Yeah.
football season.
No, totally. I wonder if we can just go back to marketing for a second. With these similarities and differences and the range of demographics depending on the sport. We were talking about what was it? Baseball fans are in their 50s. How do you put together marketing plans going forward that take all of that into consideration? So how do you reach these younger audiences in a space, for example, like baseball, where the core demo skews so much older? How do you start, to put that marketing plan together? And what do we consider wins and losses here? What is the hoped for ROI on these things?
Well, I was very fortunate because from a traditional sports standpoint, I was working in combat sports and MMA, which is one of the younger skewing traditional sports. So for me, it was like hiring companies like yours to find the XY axis of crossover. Who are the Twitch streamers who are genuine martial arts fans or genuine MMA fans or who train, and then the audience overlap is nearly complete and it's natural, right? So my job was easier than my counterpart at MLB's, for example, right? But even with MLB, I would imagine if potentially I was, in the CMO seat at MLB, is there a bridge layer where like could I have creator houses, right, that are like college baseball fans or like or like people who are trying out for the pros or could make the pros or rookie players that are kind of like bridging those worlds. But there was such a natural overlap between gamers and MMA fans that we in fact launched One Esports because as a separate company, because there was such a natural audience overlap. And what was really interesting is the biggest discovery for us wasn't the audience overlap, because that was obvious. It was, and we've been talking about monetization, the brand and sponsorship FOMO about esports.
Right.
So we reached a time when One Esports, despite being the smaller, newer organization, was
Right.
disproportionately the brand pipeline for One Championship. Toomey ended up advertising on One Championship because they entered through One Esports, and that became a more and more common story, right? That the brands, it's so obvious to brands that like, this is my younger consumer. I need to be here. I don't really get it. I need somebody to hold my hand and help me there. That FOMO became the top of the funnel for us in terms of getting overall company wide sponsorships.
I feel like the entire idea of fighting style sports. So, One Championship, so MMA, boxing, anything like that has always had a place in the gaming space. And so absolutely it's the most natural thing, to pull those things together. Is it because it's a one-on-one thing that everybody can sort of kind of relate to, regardless of age or which form of the sport you prefer? Or is there something deeper under there that just kind of makes this synergy even tighter?
I'm not sure, and it's interesting because my prediction would have been, with the rise of esports, would have led to a greater growth or rebirth in the fighting genre of games. It turned out not to be the case, right? That kind of like first person shooters and like top down games like World of Warcraft disproportionately took over the esports space, right? It wasn't sports necessarily, though
Right.
2K does a pretty good job, and it wasn't fighting games. Now those things could change, but that natural synergy hasn't seemed to follow in terms of, if you look at, esports viewership, or if you look at like, gaming sales charts. So that was a bit of a surprise to me that exactly what you talked about didn't happen to the degree that I thought it might.
Right. It felt like it just went one way, right? Like all
Yeah.
the fighting games drew in, the MMA fans, and then the fighting games went away and MMA kind of exploded. How do you
And
deal
also,
with?
sorry, if I can add
No,
to
no.
that, it was also interesting where the fighting games that remained became licensed games tied to sort of like, the biggest IP, right? That the the WWE game and the UFC game became really the last people standing in that space, right? As opposed to like the more traditional, kind of fighting games that we grew up with.
Right. Yeah, and some of that, I think, bad timing on their part. The main tournament that really builds, I think, changed hands right about that time and went to Sony, and it got canceled, and then COVID happened, and so then it didn't happen at all in Vegas. I feel like they were just getting their so many of these things feel like they were just getting their feet under them when a combination of acquisition and COVID lockdown happens, completely killing the tournament scene. Because we were at Barclays for that sold out Overwatch championship, and then absolutely seemed like it was getting ready to absolutely take off, and then all of a sudden kind of the bottom fell out. Sometimes things just happen, and it's just like it's exactly the wrong. How many times you've been around entertainment for forever, Jonathan? How many times have you seen like a writer strike or something happen in Hollywood or in the music industry that killed what looked like were careers that were just about to take, shows that were taking off, bands that were taking off, and some small dispute, some economic downturn, and you just never heard from them ever again.
Absolutely. And oddly, I think, maybe it's because of the lack of maturity. Like it sort of felt like traditional sports bounced back after COVID faster than esports, like WWE very quickly, like SummerSlam was like, bam, like new record in Las Vegas. Right. And maybe because it was like a more proven model, right? It was like a deeper groove in people's experience. The IP had like greater, sort of greater cultural value. Yeah, exactly. The foundation was just deeper is a perfect way of putting it.
Yeah, because you're right. Because those stadiums, and they talked about music tours. You couldn't even find a venue. Yet the venues that were custom built right before COVID for esports remained relatively empty, and also in the Houston Astros were finding other things to put in their esports arena down in Texas.
Yeah, it's funny. I just looked at the Allied Space in Vegas to put on an MMA event.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Nice. And I think the Luxor thought that building the HyperX stadium was going to be the answer to all their woes. And instead, it's a struggle.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Before COVID, I saw some nice synergies. Like when I was at Live by Live, we did some activations at that Luxor event, like in the parking lot, where we kind of move artists over from like a festival that took place in Vegas, like over there to perform. And, there were some nice synergies. But you're right. COVID kind of like put the brakes on that stuff. And I don't feel like
it was feeling like the Warped Tour. It felt like they became good second stages, but those build then to getting the main stage 5 years down the road, and instead it bad timing and it just died out.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up perfectly, right? That we were at that, and I want to say it again because you said it so perfectly. We were at that fulcrum point where those gaming crossovers were adding a lot of energy to, in essence, what was the second stage, right?
Yeah.
And the second stage is what makes the next generation of hits and the next generation of superstars. And
you have to have that foundation to go and make that next step. And now they're going to have to rebuild that.
Yep.
Almost from the ground up, which I think this is a really great pivot point, because we've been speaking about this so far in a very Western kind of point of view in how the West is dealing with esports and the synergies with traditional sports. Meanwhile, the East, I don't feel like this, even post-COVID, is a second stage discussion anymore. I mean, the way that esports have exploded in Southeast Asia, for example, South Korea in particular, is very different than how it's happened here. Could we just kind of get a sense of maybe why did this take off so differently and so fast there, while it kind of stalled here?
It's interesting. I think there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one is traditional sports are largely, despite the fact they have very strong Eastern audiences, are largely Western driven, right? Like they're not native. With the exception of cricket in India, right? Most of these, I spent a lot of time in China launching Call of Duty China, and the NBA is huge in China, but the NBA is Western. Right. I remember they were begging us to put Kobe in the commercial, put Kobe in the commercial. And so they don't actually get tangible chances to see Western sports as often. F1 certainly, makes appearances, like F1 in Singapore is huge. But so I think there's, to a large degree, again, with the exception of cricket in India, there's a void of native traditional sports to draw those sorts of audiences. So esports has risen to fill the void.
Right.
Secondly, I think gaming is more mobile based there than console based, and that actually increases the aperture and increases the overall fan bases. You know, like the kind of events we were putting on were like, you know, MLBB and Dota 2 and, you know, IP that aren't necessarily like console based and, you know, sort of Western. And so you have like larger user bases, you have a void of, you know, on the ground, day in and day out, competitive, you know, traditional sports to attend. And then it just became, for those reasons, a larger part of the cultural conversation there. And then once you're part of the cultural conversation, it builds on itself, right?
Right.
Would you say there's a path for that kind of explosion in the West? Is there some sport or some upcoming esport where you see that this could be the bridge? There's a potential there because there's a void in the market in a similar way there was a void in the market in Southeast Asia.
I don't see an obvious void. What I do see is the opportunity to sort of like, we still traditionally over rely on console and PC based games for like
Right.
esports here in the West. And there's obviously, even in the West, a larger mass appeal of mobile games, right? And so to me, the thing to borrow potentially from the East is there a large mass mobile based IP that just draws from, you know, I know it's a little counterintuitive because they tend to be more casual SKUs, right, than core
Right.
SKUs and everybody knows, but like, are you drawing from a bigger fan base that might actually lead to some sort of tipping point if we could
Right.
find the right mobile, if we could find the right mobile IP in the West, right? Because we are so console focused and
Yeah.
PC focused here, right? Like mobile games
Absolutely.
are like for your mom or like, or for your little brother or sister. And, you know, in the East, mobile games are for everybody, and mobile games
Right.
are the games.
I
I
think
mean, even look at,
Pokemon
Yeah.
Go is like the only one that's ever crossed that over in the
yeah.
West. It's the closest it ever got, and even Niantic and everybody who tried to copy that and find that again, they just never found it.
And look at Call of Duty Mobile has more, you
Yeah.
know,
Oh
DAUs and
yeah.
MAUs than Call of Duty Console, which
Oh,
was
absolutely.
incomprehensible at my time at Activision,
Yeah.
you know.
Oh, PUBG Mobile is 10x what PUBG is globally.
Yep.
It's massive. People look at PUBG and like, it's doing okay. Like, yeah, PUBG Mobile and Call of Duty Mobile are completely different worlds. Uh, Console and PC can't hold a flame to them globally.
You even see the same surprise. Well, it's, you know, certainly not an esport based category. You even see the same surprise like every time Activision does an earnings report, right? It's always like, what? Candy Crush is still growing 20% a year. What? Like, it's just this
Yeah.
gift that keeps on giving to their like EBITDA, right?
Right.
But there's still, I'm surprised this many years in, is always in the
Yeah.
post earnings analysis, like, what? Like, Candy
Yeah.
Crush is doing what?
Yeah. Yeah. Americans and the West just do not give credit
Yeah.
for the global market and what mobile does for it. It's just absolutely amazing.
I'd like to touch on something that I think we would be very negligent if we didn't discuss, and that is the fact that, and we mentioned it at the very beginning of this conversation, largely sports and esports are white males, 24 to 30, right? How do we increase diversity in this space? How do we bring in, with acceptance, other types of e-athletes and not just keep this white male dominated control of esports?
Well,
What's needed?
I'd like to reframe that a little bit. The slight reframe I would say is the fan bases of sports and esports are predominantly younger and male. I don't believe they're predominantly white. You know, certainly if you look at traditional sports, if you look at the viewership, if you look at the over indexing, if who's on the field, it's absolutely not white.
Right.
I look at like console sales and console titles. There's obviously always been an over indexing of people of color on the gaming side. The problem is the loudest, most toxic voices have been
Oh,
predominantly
okay.
white
Good
men.
point.
100%.
And I think it's important to call out that difference, right?
Right.
Because I think the fan bases, and it's actually what makes the predominant voice so disappointing, right? Because I think the fan bases are actually not sort of white toxic men. The fan bases are sort of like young men who look like the world, right? And in fact, over-index in many cases to people of color,
It's
right?
the real problem.
Yeah.
Yes. And the toxicity, unfortunately, disproportionately comes from white men. And unfortunately, that's reflective of where our society is overall as a whole. And I want to call that out because gaming is often called the culprit. And I don't believe gaming is the culprit of this toxicity. The only way that gaming is the culprit of this toxicity is the same way that you could say social media is the culprit of this toxicity, which is people can hide behind anonymous persona.
Right.
And wherever people can hide behind, anonymous persona, it's hate speech is easier, harassment is easier, etc. So the fact that gaming and social media allow people to hide behind anonymous persona exacerbates the problem, but in and of itself, it isn't the problem. And I think one of the ways to solve this is actually to try to focus more on who this overarching community looks like and what they're made up of, and trying to empower the community as a whole to speak up in such a way that the conversation reflects the community, as opposed to the conversation reflects the toxic extremes of the community, right? That the categories are not defined by the worst corners of Discord, right? Or the categories, like, I remember going back years, right? Like, I'm playing Call of Duty to stay up in the game. We're dropping DLC packs. I'm playing in my living room. My wife's in the other room. The N word is being dropped like every fifth word. And she just walks out and she's like, what is that? Right? She can't believe. I can't even play those games anymore because I'm the white dad of a 6-year-old young black man in America. I can't have that on in the living room.
Right.
So it's like driven me out. I can't play multiplayer games anymore because of that stuff.
Yeah.
No, I'm really glad you took it in that direction, because I do think toxicity in general in gaming, not just in esports, it is a huge issue. But I think in esports, isn't there a place where we can engage brands and say, you need to help us be part of this solution? We need to have more voices speaking out that are engaged within this community, other than just that super toxic vocal group, and other than just the athletes themselves who are out there combating this every single day. Is there a role for brands to step in and sort of help with that?
As a guy who sat on the brand side and the publisher side, that's a hard question, right? We live in a world. I don't know if you follow the Edelman Trust study. We live in a world where now brands are trusted more than politicians. Brands are trusted more than NGOs. Brands are trusted more than the media. So there's a power there. But I think we live in a difficult place for brands, right? Where brands, there's a double-edged sword to activism, right? If you're a brand, there's a famous quote that my understanding is actually a misquote, but we've all heard it over and over again, which is somebody asked, it's a Michael Jordan thing, like, where he's like, Republicans buy sneakers too. And apparently that's like a misquote, but like, brands sit in a place, if you're a mass brand, where you have a wide range of constituents that sit under that brand roof. And we live in a world where we're in such a polarized place that brands almost can't win from sitting in the conversation, right? You have red states suing brands for climate activism and diversity activism. You have blue states suing brands for like supporting gun rights, right? Like, and brands have to navigate this like highly polarized society. That said, I'm not saying that any brand should remain silent, like around hate speech, in the arena of their conversation, right? And when I was sort of prepping for this, you were sort of talking about, you sort of raised this question, and it's a tough one because you want a certain level of debate just for engagement, right? Like I'll give you an example. So we used to let the Battlefield versus Call of Duty argument reign on our social media, right? We let people say Call of Duty sucked. We let people say Battlefield was better. And that raised engagement, and it helped us get 1 billion views and helped us get 50 million social media followers. We would ban hate speech. We would ban threats. We would ban porn, right? And so there's a fine line for brands to navigate. And again, brands should speak out against hate speech, racism, threats of violence, etc. But it is you're putting brands in a tough spot if you're asking them to be the moderators of these conversations.
I agree, and I think the best example of that probably right now is Disney, right? And what's going on with them in the state of Florida, because they did step into a conversation, and it didn't have the best outcome for them.
No, I mean, I respect them stepping into the conversation, and you know,
it's hard.
Like, I think I respect any brand who wants to wade into those conversations, right? I mean, it's very interesting because you can play both sides of it, right? Because if you look at the Super Bowl, I believe 2 of the top 10 ads were those like Jesus ads run by the guy who owns the Hobby Lobby, who believes in a lot of things that perhaps the 3 of us may or may not believe in, right?
Fair.
But does he have the right to spend the $15 million, right?
Sure.
And you know, so it's a very tough space to navigate, because I'm not sure anybody wins in silencing conversations, and I'm not sure anybody wins in censorship. And my personal belief is a lot of that just drives the most dangerous bits of the conversation underground, where they become more toxic and more dangerous, right? But again, I also, as a guy who's raising, you know, a young black man in America, I want my son to feel safe. I want my son to feel proud of who he is and what he looks like. And these are the difficult, complex things we need to navigate, between where stifling speech is unhealthy and unsafe to when allowing too much speech is unhealthy and unsafe.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would agree with that wholly. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a great conversation. Thank you for going, on some paths that, aren't easy like this last one. But that's kind of what we like to do here is have a real conversation about real issues in the industry and in society.
I think everything in the world gets better by having real conversations with real people about real things, right? Like we're either too polite and don't have the real conversations, or we shout at each other, right? Or we don't listen to each other. And, unfortunately, we live in a world where most Americans believe that the world is too polarized, too divided, and that both ends of the spectrum are too extreme. And until we can bridge that, we're never going to find a better place as a society.
100%.
Look at that. Eloquent to close it out.
Right.
Thank you so
my
much.
Friend. I'm so grateful that you're able to come out.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It was a great conversation. Hopefully it was a thoughtful conversation, in the polarized times that we live in. And hopefully I'll see you guys at DICE.
All right. I'll see you soon,
Awesome.
buddy.